Another update on SP 1744. TSG Multimedia has been keeping up with us, which is hard to do because we're moving around. Today we're not at Brightside. We are actually in Sacramento at the California State Railroad Museum's shop facility. And there's a couple neat things about doing work up here. Number one, this is the original Central Pacific shops that was built for the Central Pacific Railroad back in 1869. One of these buildings dates way back into that time period. I'm not up on the entire history, but this shop's facility was the main shops for the Central Pacific. They built a lot of early engines here because they didn't have connections to the outside world. Central Pacific kind of developed the mantra that they were going to take care of themselves. All the heavy industry was on the East Coast. They had to tool up and get everything they could, and they wanted to be able to do everything up to building their own locomotives, which they did. The building behind me is the boiler shop, and then there's a transfer table behind this, and then there's another set of buildings behind that. So they would work on boilers here, they would roll the frames and everything into the erecting shop, and they would actually lift the boilers and set them back on the frames of, any locomotive, cab forwards down to the smaller engines like the SP060s. Speaking of which, SP 1269, which Pacific Locomotive Association has in our collection, it's an S12 switcher. It was actually built here in Sacramento. It has a Sacramento Locomotive Works builder's permit. SP built the whole thing. That's just a little bit of history. It's really cool to be here because the SP 1744 actually was serviced and shopped here multiple times in its lifetime. You saw previously on the channel where we were pulling tires off the driver centers. Anytime you pull the tires off to do it right, you want to turn the center because with all the reciprocating forces on a steam engine, over time the tires will flatten in areas, so it's not going to be perfectly round. So we're going to put them up in a lathe, we're going to turn them down and get them back circular, and then get exact dimensions for the wheels, and then based on those dimensions we'll order the new tires. Now the new tires aren't going to be ordered to be that dimension. They'll actually be about an 1/8 inch smaller than that dimension because like we did when we took the tires off, to put the new tires on we got to heat them up and expand them to get them on the wheel center. And then when they cool they'll shrink and they're held on the wheel center by that shrinkage. So that's part of the work. While we have them up in the lathe, we're going to true up the thrust bearings, which is on the face of the driving wheels on the inside. That's what controls the lateral, keeps the wheel from moving back and forth. There's a certain lateral that you need there. We're going to clean that up because we want it smooth when we redo the work on the driving boxes so the rough lateral doesn't tear up the new driving box lateral bearings. And then we're going to do a clean cut on the journals. Stathi Pappas with Stockton Locomotive Works is actually doing the work for us, and he's got a wheel up in the lathe right now. He checked the journals and they're within 3,000ths, which is perfectly suitable, but we're just going to do a clean pass on them to just clean them up so everything's new when we put this thing back together. We are really lucky to be able to do this work here at the California State Railroad Museum shops. In the museum industry, people help each other. We're a very small industry. We don't have a lot of resources, so places like this, they have a lot of large machine tools that we don't have. So when we have something that we can't do and we have the chance to do it here, it makes real sense to do it for us because we can come up here and help, save a little money by using our volunteers to help the contractor with the work. The other thing is, any of these rebuild projects, you know, there's not a lot of engines that are rebuilt from the ground up. And the important thing about running steam in the 21st century is you need to really understand how the locomotive works and what you need to do to maintain them, because none of us want to do this work again. And it only takes a little not paying attention to what you're doing to do some serious damage. I mean, the steam engines are really, you know, you can run them till they're wore out beyond belief, but you need to watch certain things. And one of the nice things about putting it back together from ground up is you see all the parts, like you did on the last video that we did at Brightside. We had the frame clear of all the wheels and drivers, and you could see the frame, you can see how the suspension works. Well, you don't see that when the engine's in one piece. So it's all a learning experience for all of us as we move through the rebuild on this locomotive.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Charles Franz. I'm with the PLA Niles Canyon Steam Department, and we are here in the Sacramento General Shops, the old SP shops that are now run by the California State Railroad Museum. Behind me we're turning the #1 driver on the 1744. Mr. Stathi Pappas is helping us with cleaning up a whole bunch of stuff on the wheels, the axles, and sort of the basic frame and underlying parts of the locomotive. California State Parks was gracious enough to allow us the shop space and the tools and materials to bring all three of these axles up here, which is much closer to our home in Sonol. And it allows us as volunteers to sort of be closer to the work and learn, and also just be more engaged with the process and take more of the work on ourselves as well. We went out to bid with several different companies in the industry as far as doing the work, and we got a lot of very good and responsive bids, but this was sort of the most attractive to us because we could be a little more part of the process. Behind me right now, what they're doing is they're turning the outside face of the wheel center itself. As you may have seen in previous videos, we removed the tires to heat them up to beat them off, and then, you know, what that allows you to do is clean up that inner face, the inside rim face of the wheel, get everything trued up, you know, the run out exactly how we want it. And this is going to be really important to the project because it's kind of the foundation of the locomotive. And if we can get everything, all the meat and potatoes really spot on, it'll allow us sort of minimal maintenance for the life of the locomotive, and we'll get a lot more life out of the project that way. So that's what we're working on today. Again, special thanks to Stathi Pappas and Stockton Locomotive Works and California State Parks and the California State Railroad. The last time we saw these drivers you see behind me here, they were at Brightside. We had just burned the tires off, and these are being prepared to go into the lathe to clean up the outside. But before that, there's a lot of repairs that need to be made in the spokes along the hub. Requires a lot of grinding out. You know, these engines in the end of their lives, they kind of got piecemealed back, not necessarily back together, but whatever the railroad could do to keep them running, which ends up with, you know, a lot of repairs that maybe weren't done the best they could have been done. And so what we're trying to do is address as much of that as we can. We're grinding everything out, we're cleaning everything up, mag part, looking for cracks, correcting cracks, and then once they're in a condition where they're cleaned up and ready to go, they'll get sent over to the lathe and cleaned up in the lathe. So that's what we're doing here.
My name is Stathi Pappas. I'm the owner of Stockton Locomotive Works, and we serve the heritage railroad industry doing work on primarily steam locomotives, but also historic railroad cars for a number of different institutions. Today, we're helping out the Pacific Locomotive Association and Niles Canyon Railroad with their locomotive 1744. We're turning the drivers. This has been really a partnership in many ways between the Pacific Locomotive Association, Stockton Locomotive Works, and then our hosts here at California State Railroad Museum to be able to use their big lathe and their facility here in Sacramento. This building actually is the original Sacramento General Shop's boiler shop for the Southern Pacific. And so it's really kind of amazing to have this big ticket steam locomotive work happening in this facility in this day and age. It really is living history and an homage to what thousands of people would do on a daily basis throughout the early decades of the 20th century here. So we're just very pleased to be able to help the Pacific Locomotive Association, and with the help of our friends and colleagues at California State Railroad Museum, bring this locomotive back to life. We're machining these driving wheel centers down, so these no longer have the tire on them. New tires will be fitted to these centers. For the tires to shrink and fit and stay on these wheel centers, they have to be absolutely round, and they need to not have any taper in them. So that's the reason why we're using this large lathe to be able to turn these faces down to receive their new tires. Now, we found a number of different things going on. These are steel wheel centers, which is good because weld repair is something that's possible on a steel wheel center, and it's far less difficult to deal with than a cast iron wheel center, which requires very specific processes. The Southern Pacific did a lot of weld work on these faces at some point in the past as well, and built them up for a set of tires probably towards the end of the steam era that they had on hand that they needed to make fit these wheel centers. Their welding procedures were, by today's standards, very primitive. The electrodes that they would use were not as sophisticated as what we have now, and also the procedures in the welding machines themselves were not as sophisticated. So you can see, as we machine away this material, you can see the porosity left from their welding process. You can see some of the gaps and some of the inclusions that they left. And then we can also see from the original manufacturing process from Baldwin in the early 20th century, where there were these steel blocks that were sort of cast into these castings as they were being fabricated in Philadelphia at Baldwin Locomotive Works. So as you start machining into a piece like this, there's a lot that you learn about how it was done and the alterations and work that was done to these components over time. And as an industrial archaeology type of person, this all is very fascinating in that it tells you stories about the locomotive that you wouldn't have known unless you embarked on this type of work. So we will be machining a lot of this away to make sure that we're to a good and safe surface for those new tires to be matched onto. But as we do it, we get a lot of information of what they were doing in the past and how they were doing it. And it also tells you why you're doing it in the present day, so that you can make sure that this locomotive has many decades of safe and suitable service ahead of it. So with these steel wheel centers, there was a great deal of repair work that was done to them historically. As originally manufactured, these were an interrupted hub, and they had a block of metal that would be in a gap, and then you'd shrink the tire on it. At some point in the past, the Southern Pacific decided to weld in those blocks so that presumably they wouldn't come loose in service, which would be considered to be a defect. Unfortunately, when that work was done, the electrode choice that they used and the amount of cleanliness of the welding area in the welds that they did made for welds that were somewhat brittle, and in fact they ended up cracking. And so in these wheel centers, we have located a number of cracks in these wheel rims that were directly related to the weld procedures that they were using, the lack of cleanliness, and the electrode choices, etc. And again, electric welding was very much in its infancy in the early 20th century. In today's day and age, you can't let a crack in a wheel hub or a wheel rim, be in service. So this is something that we needed to repair. A lot of the weld that they put in this area contained a lot of porosity, slag inclusions, etc. And that's probably what ultimately contributed to that being able to crack. And so all that material that they had deposited via electric welding had to be removed before new welding could be undertaken. So there's a reason why you see such a wide area opened up in this, because that's where the contaminated material was. We are using modern electrode to be able to do the filler metal with adequate preheat and post-heat to make sure that there isn't any shocking going on to the metal or extra stress put on the steel casting. Because if you do something along those lines, if you put too much stress into that casting, you can propagate another crack somewhere else, and then you end up just chasing cracks rather than fixing the problem. So there are a number of very specific procedures for modern electric welding, and we are following the pressure vessel standards for what we're doing in terms of the prep, the preheat, the electrode choices, etc., and then using that to fill in here. You'll notice on the sides things look a little bit rough. Once we're done building out to flush in this plane, then we will scarf away this material here, and then we will fill that in with clean material so that at the end of the day you have a weld that's X-ray quality and is sure to be strong and suitable for many decades of service to come. So that back scarfing method is sort of typical to ensure that the metal doesn't have any of these inclusions or defects in it like the historic welding did. So Stockton Locomotive Works is also assisting Pacific Locomotive Association with the boiler overhaul of 1744, and the pressure vessel is actually at our facility in Antonito, Colorado, which is where Stockton Locomotive Works is based out of. So we are putting an entirely new firebox and all the stay bolts in that boiler. We just completed the sheetwork, welding, and mud ring riveting actually in December, and are embarking on the stay bolt installation next. So there's a fair amount of work going into that pressure vessel, and in many ways the 1744 locomotive will be almost like new when complete. It's getting most of a running gear rebuild, it's getting a new firebox, a complete boiler overhaul, and then the boiler will be re-erected on the frame. And I can't say enough good things about the project. The scope of work is certainly extensive, but it will yield a locomotive that's well thought out, well put together, and will certainly serve their interests at Niles Canyon Railway for a good long time. And that's really what it's all about. When you have a locomotive apart, there's really no economy in shorting the amount of work that you do to it, because you'll only pay for that on the backside of things with increased maintenance costs and a lack of reliability. So we at Stockton Locomotive Works are very happy to be able to assist them in their project. We think that it's a very noble endeavor to bring a California Southern Pacific locomotive back to its home state to operate on original Southern Pacific Railroad trackage. Can't say enough good things about being able to see that when that happens.
So if you're interested in getting involved, Niles Canyon Railway is always looking for volunteers for anything we do. And I'm sure I've said before, we need volunteers to help in the steam department, we need volunteers to work on diesels, we need volunteers to train crew, station agents. There's a job for anybody and any skill set. And none of us knew how to do this stuff when we came. We've all kind of learned on the job, knowledge being passed down from older members or other people in the industry. So we can always use the help. We can also use financial donations. This project up here cost us money to have the contractor doing the work, and we're giving the state a little bit of money as well to help with their maintenance of their machinery. So any of those things. And if you're interested in Niles Canyon, what we're doing, you can go to our website, www.ncry.org, and from there you can get in and see, what we do, our collection. There's different websites for different locomotives and cars. There's a whole website for the steam department, and we update that fairly regularly with the work we're doing on the 1744. So if you keep up looking at that, we put pictures up as we make progress on the locomotive. So we thank you for watching, and we thank TSG Multimedia for giving us the opportunity to share this with all of you.